CGI is now so commonplace it's more of a story when an action movie doesn't use it. But back in 1991, digital effects relied on about as much computing power as a Casio watch. So how did Terminator 2 manage to shoot scenes that stood up 30 years after their release? With a unique and groundbreaking method of combining effects that would win 4 Oscars and change the industry forever. This is how they did it.
Hasta la vista, baby.
When James Cameron said, "I want a liquid man morphing through solid materials," the effects teams probably said, "I want a bonus." This is because the tech to achieve these effects didn't exist. New software needed to be specifically written to produce shots like the T-1000 walking through bars. Then, when it was made, the computers at the time were being milked harder than the Terminator franchise would be as a whole. Each shot, even though it lasted about 5 seconds on the screen, would take about 8 weeks to complete. The team at legendary effects studio Industrial Light and Magic began by painting a 2x2-inch grid on a near-naked Robert Patrick and shot footage of him walking through the studio parking lot in San Rafael, to the confusion of passing drivers. They then laser-scanned his head at the genuinely named Cyberware Laboratory, which sounds like it was more part of the Terminator problem rather than solving it, and 4 separate computer models of the T-1000 were built on Silicon Graphics Iris 4Ds, from an amorphous blob to a super-detailed chrome replica of Patrick, each with equivalent points in 3D space, so that the custom software model interp could morph between them. Other custom applications that were needed included body SOC. Rather than what a bank robber might put over his head to commit a crime, it was actually to fill in the gaps that initially appeared when the virtual models flexed their joints. Polyalloy shader was another application built, which gave the T-1000 its chrome appearance. Then there was Make Sticky, where images of Patrick were texture mapped onto the distorting 3D model, like the iconic scene I mentioned earlier when he melts through a barred gate at the mental hospital. Essentially, when the team bid to work on the project, they had no idea how they were going to pull off the shots, but they had the potential tech to do it, so they took a gamble and went for it. This is why nothing like this had been seen on screen before. When it was shown in cinemas, audiences worldwide were choking on their popcorn as they saw the T-1000 doing its best impression of an ice cream left in the sun for too long, coming back to life. Once the team had created suitable images of the T-1000, the special effects crew faced another traditional challenge: getting their visuals into the live action without the uncanny valley swallowing them up.
Look, Jabba, even I get bored sometimes.
Computers produce essentially flawless images, and artists often have to add grain and blur to match the images to their surroundings. If you want to see this done badly, then look at the contrast between the razor-sharp CGI scenes and the ever so slightly blurred live action that created a jarring discontinuity in 1984's The Last Starfighter. The subtle details made all the difference. In another memorable scene when the T-1000 rises out of the floor, 2 things make it look convincing. 1, the reflection of the surroundings on the surface of the cyborg, and 2, the tiny reflection his foot makes on the polished floor. During tests of this scene, the team at ILM asked each other, "Why does that foot look like it's not on the floor?" It's because it was missing something as small as 1/4 of an inch of drop shadow around it. This might seem like a small detail, but it meant that Terminator 2 was a movie where CGI made it better, not one where CGI took you so far out of the action that it dominated, like Tron or The Last Starfighter we mentioned earlier. The thing that a lot of future movies forgot was that it takes more than just throwing CGI at an action movie to make it good. Case in point, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and a not-so-honourable mention to the Fast and Furious franchise. The amazing combination of digital and practical effects used by director James Cameron in this movie would inspire directors like Christopher Nolan in his Batman trilogy and other films like Inception. This is where Terminator 2 really went beyond what had gone before. Rather than doing what most studios do now and making the whole thing look like a video game, the team at Stan Winston's effects studio helped to make physical puppets that could be twinned with graphics to twist and turn Patrick into a part man, part Play-Doh hybrid. The end result was the most nightmarish putty model of all time. There were a few scenes that really show off this technique in all its glory, and all brilliantly named. So let's start with Splashhead. When John and the Terminator break out the recently buffed Sarah Connor from the state hospital, the T-1000's head is split apart by Arnie's point-blank gunfire. This made it look like Moses had been doing his handiwork on the T-1000's head. For this, Stan Winston and co. built 2 articulated puppets. The first was used for the shot of the head initially springing open, viewed from behind the T-1000. Studio artists sculpted the actor into clay, then split that clay sculpture down the middle and pulled it open, sculpting what they called a splash area into the middle of it. A foam rubber puppet was then made from the molds of that sculpture. The puppet had a hinged fiberglass core that did the neat trick of splitting Patrick's head open with the pulling of a single pin, and what I would give to have that for Halloween. The next shot from the front was even more difficult. It needed eye mechanisms working independently on either side of the T-1000's split face. Pulley mechanisms did the job of an Alka-Seltzer after a night out and pulled the two sides of the head back to the middle to start the healing effect. This was polished off by the computer effects team at ILM. The puppet was created from a life cast of Robert Patrick and made of foam rubber with a vacuum metallized inner portion, where metal coating material is vaporized inside a vacuum chamber. This was then coated with Krylon Crystal Clear, giving that chrome look that was very in season back in 1991. The final splash head unit was worn by Patrick's double for shots of the molten robot stumbling backwards from the elevator as his head wound continued to heal. This was a brilliant example of digital and physical effects working in harmony, which would also be the case when it came to the T-1000 becoming a bullet sponge. The production team behind Terminator 2 were adamant that physical effects be used if possible, which meant that Stan Winston really earned his money when it came to this movie. It was a step up from the work that they did on the original Terminator, which I've done a separate video on, so take a look at that at the end after this one. Anyway, Arnie was always going to unload his lead all over the T-1000 in this film, but the question was, how was this going to be shown on screen? If ILM could make a man walk through metal, then surely they could stick a few bullets in him. Instead, it was Stan Winston's crew that figured this out, spending weeks shooting pellets into mud, studying the patterns made by the impact, which does sound like a fun job. They then duplicated this in sculpted form and produced versions that could be applied to Patrick. Vacuum metallizing slip rubber latex material, backed with soft foam rubber or polyfoam, got the chrome look. These splash appliances were sculpted and produced in lots of different patterns and sizes. Then were fitted with iris petal-like spring-loaded mechanisms that would open on cue when the bullets were supposed to hit. Think of them like metal flowers opening their beauty, but instead of sunlight, they needed Schwarzenegger's unrelenting ammo. This flowering mechanism was attached to a fiberglass chest plate that was worn by Robert Patrick under a pre-scored costume that was triggered by a single radio-controlled cable pin release. The pin's release would open the petals, replacing that area of the costume with a chromed bullet splash. Again, just like the splash head effect from earlier, CG was used to fill in the bullet holes as Patrick becomes healed. But there was only so much healing the T-1000 could do. As the movie reached its conclusion, the game-changing effects weren't letting up, and these next ones had surprisingly little CGI behind them. How do you slice a man and turn him into a pretzel? These were genuine questions that had to be considered on set when Terminator 2 was being made. Originally, for the shot where the T-800 turns his opponent into cheese with an iron bar, Winston had assumed that he would have to build an entire puppet for the effect. He breathed a sigh of relief when James Cameron said he would be willing to shoot it from a locked-off camera angle. This meant that rather than having the camera move around the T-1000, a more simple approach could be taken, and when I say simple, I mean not quite as complicated as he originally thought. Effects artist Christopher Swift sculpted a foam rubber body appliance that was given that familiar chrome effect in the liquid metal splash area. That appliance was then pressed firmly against Robert Patrick's body to look like his right shoulder and side, whilst the actor bent his real shoulder and side backwards. With a little bit of camera angle trickery, it looked like Robert Patrick appeared to be standing in a normal position. And when Arnold Schwarzenegger brought the steel rod down through the split line between Patrick's body and the appliance, the device sprang open. Voila! A man split apart before your very eyes. And if you thought having a bar slice you open is bad, what about being shot in the stomach with a grenade launcher? This called for arguably the most complex shot Stan Winston needed to come up with. The team built 3 final T-1000 puppets for the Pretzel Man effect, when the character gets blown open. The first puppet was a spring-loaded replica of Robert Patrick in a splayed open position, which was able to be closed up through cables and then released to create the exploding Patrick while a pneumatic ram drove his head upwards. A second stage Pretzel Man puppet was built for shots when the T-1000 stumbles back towards his warm bath. He should have been more careful, really. The puppet was mounted onto gimbals at the ankles to create a teetering motion, and the other body movements were achieved through rods puppeteered by a crew below the set. Jaw and eye movement in the head were radio controlled, and the spinning head action was cable controlled. And there was me thinking puppets just needed you to put a hand up them.
Put that cookie down! Now!
A third non-articulated Pretzel Man puppet had a 35-pound weight in its back to get it to fall to its doom. It was an underlit gelatinous concoction created by the special effects team. Underlit gelatinous concoction would also be a great name for a jazz band, don't you think? Once the T1000 falls into its less than relaxing deep bath, the CG effects team were brought in to create the greatest hits of all the characters it had morphed into, before finally settling on Dead.